Unfiltered Political Lens. Thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you for being here for another deep dive conversation where we go beyond the headlines and take a closer look at the stories reshaping our world on this channel. We slow things down, connect the dots, and break major developments into clear conversations that help you better understand what's happening globally and how those changes may eventually affect everyday life here at home. Tonight's episode covers one of the most important geopolitical developments unfolding in the world right now. It is a story that stretches across Europe, Asia, the Middle East, global financial markets, energy infrastructure, military strategy, and international diplomacy. We're taking a deep look at the growing strategic relationship between Russia, China, and Iran, and why this emerging partnership is drawing so much attention from the political leaders and economists, military analysts, and everyday citizens across the globe. This is bigger than one news cycle. It's bigger than one war. It's bigger than one diplomatic meeting or in political speech. What we are talking about tonight has the potential to influence our global trade, the future of the U.S. dollar, oil prices, military alliances, sanctions policy, and inflation, and the long-term balance of the world power for years to come. The phrase many people are using to describe this shift is the new axis of power. It's a phrase that immediately grabs attention because it suggests something larger than cooperation. It suggests realignment. And while the phase can sometimes sound dramatic, there is no question that the relationship between Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran have become stronger and deeper and more strategically important over the past several years. To understand why this matters, we have to begin with the bigger historical picture following the end of the Cold War. The United States entered a period of enormous global influence. American military power and economic leadership, diplomatic reach, and the strength of the U.S. dollar had placed Washington at the center of the international system. For decades, much of the global economy operated around American institutions. International banking relied heavily on dollar transactions, and major commodities were priced in dollars. U.S.-led alliances shaped the military strategy across the multiple continents, and Americans' policy decisions carried worldwide consequences. But history never remains frozen. Over that time, the world began changing, and China grew into an economic superpower with expanding global influence. Russia reasserted its military and geopolitical power after the Soviet collapse, and Iran maintained regional influence despite actions and years of economic pressure. And as these shifts continued, the global balance slowly became more competitive and more complex. The changing environment created space for new partnerships as well. Russia, China, and Iran do not form a formal alliance in the traditional sense. They do not operate under a mutual defense treaty like NATO. There is no legal obligation requiring all three nations to fight on each other's behalf. But that does not mean their growing relationship should be dismissed. What existed today is something even experts describe as strategic alignment. It is a partnership built around overlapping goals, shared interests, and coordinated diplomacy. The growing economic cooperation and the resistance to certain forms of Western political and financial pressure, it is flexible, evolving, and increasingly significant. Each country enters this relationship from the different position. Russia views the partnership through the lens of security sanctions, resilience, energy strategy, and geopolitical competition. And with NATO and the West, particularly after the war in Ukraine and the sanctions that followed, Moscow began shifting more heavily toward Eastern economic partnerships. China enters from a position of economic strength, and Beijing's long-term priorities include trade manufacturing, infrastructure development, technology, access to resources, and global influence through economic expansion. China's leadership continues pushing for a larger voice in global governance and less U.S. centered international order. In Iran's strategic calculation, it is different but connected. Tehran has spent decades operating under sanctions and navigating the pressures from Western governments while seeking a stronger economic partnership and security cooperation, as well as regional leverage. Russia and China provide both diplomatic value as well as economic opportunity. These three governments do not always agree with one another. Their systems are different, their economies are different, and their regional priorities are different. Their internal political pressures are different, but they increasingly share several broad objectives. They want greater freedom from Western sanctions and pressure. They want more options outside of U.S. dominated financial systems, and they want stronger influence within their own regions. And they want a world where global power is distributed across multiple centers instead of concentrated primarily around the United States. One of the most important parts of this conversation involves money, specifically the U.S. dollar. The U.S. dollar remains the dominant reserve currency in the world today. It plays a central role in the international banking, trade settlement commodities, pricing sovereign reserves, and financial transactions across nearly every major economy. Now, this dominance gives the United States an extraordinary leverage because so much of the global economy touches the dollar. The American sanctions can have worldwide effects restricting access to the dollar. Based systems can impact the governments, industries, banks, and corporations far beyond the U.S. borders. And that power has become one of Washington's strongest geopolitical tools. And it is also one of the main reasons Russia, China, and Iran have increasingly explored alternatives. Now, this is where the de-dollarization conversation will come into focus. The de-dollarization does not mean that the U.S. dollar disappears overnight, and it does not mean a sudden collapse of the American financial system. It also does not mean another currency has officially replaced the dollar globally. What it does mean is that the countries are working to reduce the dependence on the dollar only transactions where possible. That includes settling some trade in national currencies and expanding the yen-based payments, increasing bilateral agreements outside of the dollar channels and building regional payment systems, and exploring the alternative ways to conduct trade without relying entirely on Western-controlled financial infrastructure. China has become central in that effort because of the scale of its economy and the global trade reach. Russia has accelerated this transition due to the sanctions and the pressure, and Iran has pursued similar pathways out of the economic necessity after years of financial restrictions. Energy is another major reason this relationship matters. Russia is one of the world's largest energy exporters. Iran controls vast oil and natural gas reserves and sits near one of the most strategically important waterways on Earth. China is one of the largest energy consumers in the world, and that creates a powerful economic triangle, which Russia supplies, Iran influences the regional access, and China consumes. And because the energy sits at the center of the global economy, this relationship affects far more than oil alone. A key geographic focal point is the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow maritime route near Iran carries a massive portion of the world's oil shipments every day. It remains one of the most strategically important shipping corridors on the planet. If instability rises there, markets react fast and the oil prices can spike. Shipping costs can rise and insurance costs can increase. Supply chains can tighten and fuel prices can climb rapidly. Now, for Americans, this can become very personal very quickly. Higher oil prices often mean higher gasoline prices, and the higher transportation costs can increase grocery prices as well. Airfare can rise and manufacturing becomes more expensive. Delivery costs also increase and inflation becomes harder to manage. And this is why the international events in the Gulf or the Middle East can eventually show up at the local gas station, at the grocery store, or in households' monthly budgets across America. The military cooperation also adds another layer in the story. Russia, China, and Iran have held joint naval exercises in the Gulf of Oman and nearby regional waters. These operations often included coordinated fleet movement, communication drills, rescue exercises, and anti piracy training and maritime security operations. These exercises are important not only for the political military coordination but also for symbolism. They show willingness to operate together publicly and they signal strategic alignment. The demonstrated shared presence is important in the waterways and they communicate a broader message to both regional powers as well as Western governments alike. The military analysts also continue watching areas such as drone systems, weapons technology, missile deployment, logistics coordination, and surveillance cooperation, as well as broader defense ties among these countries. Now, at the same time, there are clear limitations to the partnerships. China's economic interests are not identical to Russia's military goals, and Iran's regional calculations do not always match China's global trade strategy. Russia's priorities in Europe may not always overlap with Beijing's economic planning in Asia either. And China's economy is also significantly larger than either Russia or Iran's, which creates an imbalance inside the relationship itself. So while this partnership is important, it is not seamless. It is not without tension. It's not without perfectly unified or powerful, but complicated. Cooperative but transactional and strategic but still evolving. And for the United States, the long-term implications are substantial. Washington may continue strengthening military alliances abroad, and economic resilience at home may become more important. The energy policy may remain central to national strategy, and supply chains, domestic manufacturing, infrastructure security, and technological competitiveness may also become larger pieces of America's long-term response. For everyday Americans, the effect may continue showing up through the inflation, fuel costs, interest rates, global trade disruptions, and economic uncertainty tied to geopolitical tensions abroad. And perhaps the biggest question remains unanswered. Are we watching a temporary partnership formed around current global events? Or are we witnessing the early stages of a lasting geopolitical bloc that could help reshape the global order over the coming decades? That answer is still unfolding in real time. But that is clear is that the relationship between Russia, China, and Iran has become increasingly important in global affairs. It is influencing diplomacy, economics, energy markets, military planning, as well as strategic thinking across the world. Now, this story is still being written, and the decisions made in Washington and Moscow and Beijing and Tehran over the next several years may shape the direction of the global economy and international politics for generations. I want to thank you once again so much for tuning in to another episode of the Unfiltered Political Lens. If you found this deep dive helpful, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Where do you think this alliance goes next, and what does it mean for America and the future of the global power? If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you again for spending your time here with me, and just to stay informed and stay engaged and keep asking the questions. And I look forward to seeing you in the next episode of the Unfiltered Political Lens. Peace. Thank you.